Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Gift of the Mormon Faith Crisis podcast. I am one of your co-hosts, Dr. John Dehlin, and I am eternally joined by my eternal companion.
Wow. Margi Dehlin.
And of course, we always have remote live from Wichita, Kansas.
This is Natasha Helfer Parker. I've covenanted to nothing eternal.
You did it one time.
Yes, I did, but not with you guys.
Oh, okay. It is January 15th, 2019. We are back broadcasting the weekly Gift of the Mormon Faith Crisis podcast episode. We've got several that we've released on iTunes and on YouTube, and we're back. We're going strong, and we're going to do this for a year or two weekly, and we're going to do this until we release a book. Is that right?
Sounds like it.
That's the plan.
That's the plan.
Yes.
So we're in the background, slowly working on a book, and we're grateful for everyone who is supporting us. So thanks for joining us today. Let's begin discussing our mission, because we like to always start with our mission. Natasha, how would you feel about reading our mission really quick so that everyone who's new can know what we're trying to do here?
Okay, so our mission is to have positive, practical, and personal tips for navigating a Mormon faith crisis. Or, and this is really important as well, we're also here to help those wishing to understand those in faith crisis. And we always give a shout out to Margi for coming up with positive, practical, and personal, because we love it.
That's right. So that's why we're here. And kind of the reason why we've named it what we've named it is that as awful as a faith crisis can feel, as traumatic, as calamitous as it can sometimes be in your life, after collectively all of us working with thousands, if not tens of thousands of people over the past 20 years, what we found is that it can be an amazing gift and an important instigator to creating a big and a bold and a beautiful life, unlike you've ever imagined. So we want to give people a glimmer of hope. And that's why our logo is shining and dripping with yellow.
We love yellow.
New life.
Because it's
Little
sunlight
green.
and life.
Yeah.
And that little green sprout. So that's what we're about. Thanks for joining us. And as always, each of us has a personal side or professional side outside of what we all do. Margi, why don't you tell us what you do professionally outside of this podcast?
Sure. So I am a life transitions coach. And so I work with all things that life transitions tend to touch. So that's like relationships, grief. And you can kind of see a little bit of what I do on my website. It's called beautyinthenow.org.
And if someone wants to get some coaching support from you, they can go there as well.
That's right. Everything's there.
All right, Natasha, tell us about your professional life outside of this podcast.
Sure. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, as well as a certified sex therapist. I run an online practice, do several blogs and other podcasts as well. I run the Mormon Mental Health podcast. So lots of different things. And all of that can be found at natashaparker.org. So everything that I'm doing.
All right. And again, I have a coaching practice as well. I have a PhD in clinical and counseling psychology. I run the Mormon Stories podcast at mormonstories.org. That's how I'm maybe most well known. But in addition, for couples or individuals that are really struggling in their faith crisis, mixed faith marriage stuff, LGBT stuff, existential stuff, whatever it is, I can support you. You can go to johndehlin@gmail.com and /private practice, and you can find out how to get my support. All right, so that's each of us. What we do have an event coming up that we hope to fill. We may not fill it, but Natasha, why don't you tell us about that event that we have coming up if there's an interest or a need.
Yeah, so we have an intensive couples retreat. We've done a lot of kind of overall general retreats, the three of us together in the past. And usually at these events, we have people come up to us and say, this is also very helpful, but we would, really like to dive even deeper into some of these things that are affecting our marriage and our relationship in particular. So we came up with the weekend after Valentine's Day because we thought that would be a nice time for a couple to treat themselves to an intense retreat where you would have access to the three of us, and we're only making space for 6 couples because we do want it to be intensive and very personalized to your situations. And it's Friday through Sunday. And all of that information can be found on the events page if you're interested in registering. We probably do need to hear from you, before too long, as far as, going right into May, that first week of February, because if so, we need to make travel arrangements for me to come out, and also venue arrangements and all those things that we want to make it really comfortable for everybody who wants to attend. So please consider that. This retreat is in particularly meant for those who are, in a sense, transitioning together. Not everybody transitions necessarily on the same timeline, but if you're part of a marriage where you're transitioning somewhat together in your Mormonism, there can be a lot of things that you're still needing to navigate, even though you're on the same page. And we're planning to do a similar one in the fall that's for mixed faith marriage couples, where we'll do kind of the same intensive thing for 6 couples that are in a mixed faith relationship where one is transitioning and one is not. So yeah, that's the info, I think.
All right. Thank you. We want to do a shout out to several new donors. So over the Christmas break and the past week or so, we've had several people sign up as monthly donors to this podcast, The Gift of the Faith Crisis. I think I counted, we have 12 now.
Woo!
So we've gone from just 1 or 2 to 12. And some of the new donors include Timothy, Jennifer, Adam, Michelle, Jasmine, Allison, and Amber.
Welcome, and thank you.
If I forgot anyone, let me know, and we'll shout out to you next time. But we don't do this podcast for the money, but I think at least Margi and Natasha deserve to be paid for this work. And I don't mean to exclude myself, but I think that you guys deserve that, and so I want to make sure that happens. So don't do it for me, but if you want to support Natasha and Margi in this work, if I have to, I'll give them all the proceeds because they're blessings to this community and they deserve compensation for their time.
We are, I think, equal opportunity association here. So we want all of us to be paid for our time. We're all bringing, I think, a lot of value to this, and we all have different areas of expertise that we bring to the equation. So I think we're always in that kind of space, especially in mental health and in mental coaching and health life coaching, where it's difficult, you're wanting to help, and, all of us want to help and be super generous in that regard. And at the same time, it's our lifestyle and it's what we depend on to kind of live. So yeah, we hope if you find value in this, that you would, associate that with some type of financial equation in your mind, what that means for you.
And to do that, you can go to mormonfaithcrisis.com, and you can, at the top right, click on the donation button, and $10 a month, $25 a month, $100 a month, whatever you can afford, makes this all possible. And that reminds me, for some reason, I didn't have Anthony on my list. Anthony has joined us. Anthony is also a new donor, and he's a brilliant friend who has a lot of cool things to say about the faith crisis. He's spoken in Sunstone and other places. So shout out to Anthony Miller. And we've incorporated a few of his comments that he wrote earlier into this episode. So thanks to Anthony as well for his very generous support.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you.
Okay, we always do this What's Working section where we each share something that we're doing in our lives that's helping us heal and grow as humans. I'll start this time. What I have rediscovered, so back when I lived in Seattle, Washington, working for Microsoft, prior to my faith crisis and during, I loved audiobooks. So I'd go to the local, was it Cook County Library System? And I would check out audio tapes and CDs and listen to them. And I consumed a lot of books that way. As soon as I moved and discovered podcasts, I kind of lost my mojo for audiobooks because I was just always consuming podcasts. But there are a lot of, I need to feed my brain. Feeding my brain not only makes me smarter, it also makes me motivated for life. It gets me excited about life, about ideas. And it does well for my tendency to get a little bit moody or depressed. It just gets me excited learning new ideas. So I recently got an Audible account, and I had a coach that I go to who recommended, a shout out to Ivan. He recommended Rich Dad Poor Dad, which is a book by Robert Kiyosaki, and that was great. And now I'm listening to Esther Perel's State of Affairs, which is a book about affairs,
So good.
because I have clients who are in affairs or have experienced affairs or are trying to heal from affairs. And Natasha, I'm assuming you do a lot of affair work as well. Is that true?
That is true. And I love Esther Perel's book as well. It's a really good resource.
Yeah, so I'm listening to that book whenever I'm in the car, whenever I'm exercising. I'm probably listening to that book until I'm done with it. And so audiobooks are working for me.
That's so great.
What's working for you,
Yeah.
sweetie?
So what's working for me lately is I go to yoga class locally, and I really love this yoga class in that the makeup of the class, I think, is really unique in that I would say probably 90 to 95% of the people in my class with me are over the age of 60. And so my daughter and I go together, but it's just this, it's really inspiring and it's lovely yoga. And I'm really liking yoga as sort of, an addition to winter, because I think I get naturally kind of tight and hunched over in the cold. I just naturally sort of brace for the colder temperatures. And so it's a great way to kind of work out the kinks, and it's good for my mind. It's like mind, body, social, emotional. It's just beautiful. All the things wrapped into one.
All right.
Awesome.
Yoga.
Working for me.
What's working for you, Natasha?
Well, so what I was thinking about is in my more perfectionistic, I guess, observance of my religious tradition of Mormonism, I, would have these checklists that we're also probably familiar with, like daily scripture study and family prayer and home evening and all these different things that you're supposed to do kind of like personally and also with your family. And although a lot of those things would bring me a lot of sense of peace, it also would bring me a great deal of shame and guilt if I didn't do them as often as I thought, or, I always felt like I was letting my family down. So I've really tried to, in my own kind of thinking through my relationship with Mormonism and some of the things that we talk about in these transition podcasts is, take out of the cart what isn't good, but keep in the cart what is. And for me, one of the ways I've done this is that I really find inspirational quotes or scripture study helpful and inspiring and uplifting when I like the scriptures and when I like the quotes. And so I've tried to set up a weekly reminder. So once a week, I send out a family text where all of my immediate family is involved. And I just send them either like, of these photographs where you can find nice inspirational quotes, or I just write something myself. And that's been a nice way for me to still incorporate something that's meaningful in my life, but in a much more relaxed and non-judgment, non-shamey way. And as far as I can tell, my family doesn't mind me doing that. And sometimes it engenders conversation and sometimes nobody replies, and that's fine. But it helps me feel like I'm connecting with them in kind of a spiritual way once a week.
I love that idea.
Love it.
Can I say?
You can.
Focusing on the positive, and I do think there's something it can be very counter brain, much like gratitude is counter brain, how our brain works. So I love that.
Thanks.
Yep.
I thought about adding a new section to this intro as if we need more, but I like this idea of community shout outs, of just us mentioning people in the community that are doing really good things in the progressive and post-Mormon community. And Natasha and Margi, I invite you to think about people for future episodes we can give shout outs to. But today, I'm going to give a shout out to Leah and Cody Young.
Oh, this is a mutual shout out.
And Brinley. Yeah, so
I mean,
go ahead.
No, for sure. I'm just saying.
Yeah, so I flew to Columbus, Ohio last week and interviewed both Dan Vogel, Mormon historian, and this family, Leah and Cody Young, and their daughter, Brinley. And it's an amazing interview where they talk about their faith crisis. What was groundbreaking about it for Mormon Stories podcast was that Brinley, their 15-year-old daughter, participated in the interview. And it's the first time we've ever had a faith crisis story told from the perspective of a teenager, a 15-year-old. And she was just brilliant and lovely and thoughtful and smart. But that's not why I'm giving them a shout out. I'm giving them a shout out because they were so passionate after attending one of our retreats, and you were there, the Houston retreat, Natasha. They were so passionate about community that they started a Columbus Mormon transitions community. And we had a get together, we ate tacos one of the nights on Wednesday night, and just had like 30 people there, all from the surrounding Columbus progressive and post-Mormon community. It was just brilliant. That sort of thing only happens when community members are interested and do their part. And Leah and Cody have done that. And they're helping people find friendship and community and support, which is a really essential part of a faith crisis. So I just want to give them a shout out.
Yeah, absolutely.
They deserve it.
They do.
All right. So let's jump into today's episode because there's a lot we want to cover. So far, we have covered topics like, we've tried to give an intro. We've tried to talk about making peace with Mormonism. We've talked about all the good things that we've appreciated and valued in our faith crisis. And then we've also talked about what were the causes of our faith crisis. And those are all kind of structured, important components in the flow that we hope it makes sense for people listening to the podcast and processing their experiences. But also we hope that this will be kind of the general flow that ends up in our book. So as we try and think about this flow and this process, the next thing that came to my mind was a discussion about understanding the conversion and the deconversion process. Because, that's fundamental to pretty much any religious worldview, and especially to an orthodox religious worldview. Religions rely on conversion. And this is a little bit tricky in the Mormon context because so many Mormons nowadays were born and raised Mormon. And so a lot of Mormons really, they don't think about their conversion. They just it kind of just happened. They kind of just were born in the covenant, were raised in primary, became teenagers, and then hurried off to the mission, or got married in the temple, or went to BYU, and then started their adult life. And of course, there was this time where they said, either I've always had a testimony, or, I've always been on borrowed light from my parents, but at some point I had to gain a testimony of my own. And then each person kind of goes through whatever their conversion process is, reading the Book of Mormon or praying or going to youth conference or EFY or whatever that thing is. And then at some point they gain a testimony of their own. And from that point on, they're kind of usually committed and faithful until they're not. And that's the conversion process. And of course, there's a derivative of this, which is the Mormon convert, someone who joins as a teen or as an adult, and they have some conversion experience. My point is, if you're going to understand your faith crisis, number one, if you're going to process what you've been through, you need to understand how you got to the convert stage. And then secondary to that is, in addition to understanding where you've been, once you go through a faith crisis and everything falls apart, you have to figure out where you want to go. And it's very easy for us to fall into traps that aren't healthy or useful. In other words, we can trade one authority for another authority. We can trade one structure for another. We can trade one set of orthodoxy for another. And if we're not careful, we can have false prophets fool us. We can have unhealthy organizations pull us in. Even businesses can do that, not just religions. Podcasters and books and cultural heroes, whoever it is, we can kind of fall prey to some patterns that maybe not be healthiest for us if we're not mindful about how conversion happens. And then finally, to kind of round that out, a really important part that all of you are interested in as progressive or post-Mormons is communicating with Orthodox family and friends. And what I've discovered, and Natasha and I and Margi have led retreats about this, understanding the conversion process helps us communicate more effectively with Orthodox family and friends. And misunderstanding what it is that keeps people faithful to an Orthodox religious mindset. If we don't understand the factors that keep people faithful to that mindset, then we communicate with them not only in ways that aren't positive in terms of healthy communication, we actually can undermine the intimacy that is required for us to have healthy communication. And so understanding conversion and deconversion is useful on so many levels. And that's why we're going to talk about it today. And we want to invite you listeners. We have several people joining us through Facebook Live. We want to invite listeners to please join us because when listeners share their perspective on this live episode, it makes it more interactive and it makes it more interesting. Okay, so Natasha, do you have anything you want to add as sort of the introduction to this episode?
I don't think so. I do think that it's just important to kind of repeat that the whole process of understanding this is to better understand ourselves and to better understand others that we're wanting to stay in connection with. And I hope a lot of the principles that we're really talking about today, I think you're going to find out are not that Mormon necessarily. In other words, they're kind of more about human interactions, human processes, developmental processes. And one thing that I hope that we'll talk about a little bit too as a conjunction to this is tribal dynamics, how we interact as groups of people as well. So these are things and theories that have been talked about regardless of religion, politics, and groupings. They just kind of seem to be somewhat universal. Now, there's unique aspects that I think Mormons bring to the table in this regard, and we'll definitely kind of sort through some of those. But in general, these are human dynamics.
I love it. Do you want to add anything, sweetie?
I think probably not add, but I would probably just develop or highlight this idea, as you mentioned, kind of processing what you've been through. Also, I really like the idea of understanding conversion and deconversion as a way of self-understanding, right? Because as you kind of reflect on the things that brought you and really attracted you to religion and kept you there, you get a piece of yourself. You get to see kind of what you truly connect with and what you value. And then the same on the deconversion side. It highlights those parts of yourselves that I think can point to values. It can point to what you resonate with in life. And those are really, really key things, I think, to, navigating your life here and building, another life, if you will, or a new life after the fact. So
I love it. So thanks to you both. Shout out to Casey, Casey is also one of our donors, and we're grateful for him. Casey writes, one of the hardest parts of a faith transition is how to reconcile and interpret the spiritual faith-promoting experiences that led to our conversion. And we are going to be digging into that, Casey. So many of us had these experiences that felt very profound, that felt moving, that felt life-changing, almost like Saul on the road to Damascus, or Alma the Younger, or Joseph Smith for that matter. And we need a woman in there. Can anyone name a female conversion story that we learn about in the scriptures? Uh-oh.
Well, in some ways, isn't Esther one of them?
Okay, tell us about Esther.
Oh, now you're like going to actually make me. You didn't say the actual story.
We'll leave it at Esther.
All right, Esther, yeah. We gotta throw out Esther
to,
because we gotta have a woman mentioned.
Yeah, but she's having to like be part of a whole nother culture and family as an in-law, and I'm not sure that they were different religions, but it was just she had to do a lot of kind of, I think, self-awareness and conversion to her own principles and ideas and thoughts about what she was going to be about in life, for sure.
Thank you for that, Natasha. Our listener Jamie writes, Lamoni's wife. Thank you, Jamie, for giving us that from the Book of Mormon. I'm just going to have to say how pathetic it is that our scriptures don't provide us with more named females as heroines. But it looks like Lamoni's wife is the best we could do for the Book of Mormon. I'm sure Sariah had, I think there's only 5 women named in the Book of Mormon, if I'm right about that, 5 or 6. And so we don't have a lot of examples, but thanks, Jamie, for Lamoni's wife. All right, so good. So let's talk about this. Let's talk about understanding the conversion and the deconversion process. What I want to do as we begin is make a point that Natasha, we often make in our presentations. And for those of you who are watching, I'm actually going to share the screen just to kind of make this point. And what I'm going to show, hopefully it shows on the screen, is this image that comes from a book called The Righteous Mind. And the author is Jonathan Haidt. It's pronounced Haidt, but it's H-A-I-D-T. Book's The Righteous Mind. And basically the point he makes in the book, he likens the different 2 major parts of our brain to a rider and an elephant. The elephant, the larger, the bigger, the more strong component of our brain is what I like to refer to as the amygdala, the emotional center. It's housed literally in the center of the brain. The brainstem kind of plugs in and goes through the amygdala. And this is where we experience our emotions, or at least primarily. It is also known as the fight or flight center or system in the brain. What's meant by that is that when, we're walking along the savannah and we hear the rustling in the bush and we're fearful that a lion, we maybe are about to become lion food, the amygdala kicks in and it literally starts your heart pumping fast. It literally pumps, or endorphins or chemicals through your veins that get your muscles ready. It actually redirects blood from your brain to other parts, the extremities, your arms and your legs. It gets your lungs pumping, you're breathing. And the idea is to give you the energy and the oxygen and everything, the chemicals you need to either fight that lion to save your life or run away from the lion or climb the tree or whatever you have to do to protect your loved ones, to protect yourself, and to survive. That's the emotional center, the amygdala, and that's what Jonathan Haidt refers to as the elephant. The other part of your brain is the cerebral frontal cortex. It's the part of your brain that's literally in your forehead area. It's referred to as the executive center, as the emotion center. It's your logical brain, it's your rational brain. And that is it's evolved evolutionarily later than the amygdala. In other words, the outer parts of your brain are the newer components evolutionarily. And so if you go back 1 million years or 500 million years, whatever our ancestors were, if you're okay with the evolutionary process, whatever our ancestors were as primates or as, what are proto-primates, whatever it was, they had a brain that was less evolved. And layers of the brain have been added over time. And this cerebral frontal cortex was added last. It's the newest developing part of our brain. And again, it's the thought process, it's the reason, it's the rationality, it's the executive functioning. And so Jonathan Haidt compares that part of a brain to this rider that's sitting on top of the elephant. And the main point that he's trying to make that I think is novel to many of us who think we're rational creatures, because so many of us are like, well, I'm not emotional, I'm rational. I'm governed by reason. I'm governed by logic. I'm a logical being. And, it's fine if we think that that's primarily what rules us. Oftentimes it's more men that like to say, I'm the rational one, and it's women who go, oh, I'm more emotional. And that's, of course, false.
Nice voices, by the way.
Natasha,
really,
do you want to?
Enjoying those.
Why are you laughing, Natasha?
No, those are all very stereotypically accurate.
And damaging.
But to your point, this is also, I would say, an American culture issue. This is not necessarily the case globally.
Right.
But I think, the American masculinity model, which actually the APA just came out and very interesting position statement on that, shows how we really downplay emotion for men, even though men and women tend to be equally emotional. Mm-hmm. And I always say that, you can go to any CEO meeting with a bunch of men in it and see a lot of emotion. You can see a lot of emotion in our politics these days. You can see a lot of emotion, but we tend to downgrade emotion because we tend to correlate that with women in our American society and see that as less than. And both emotion and logic need to be working in partnership to make actually good decision-making skills. If you have either too much logic or too much emotion, that's when you can dysregulate.
Mm-hmm.
That's right. So even though stereotypically we tend to think one way or another, the truth is, unless our brain is broken, we are both logical and emotional creatures at different times. But the question is, what are we, the Jonathan Haidt's wanting to answer? And one of our listeners, Judy Judkins, shout out to Judy, she tells us she's reading Jonathan Haidt's The Righteous Mind right now. What Jonathan Haidt's trying to answer is the question of what are we primarily? When push comes to shove and the rubber meets the road, who wins, the reason or the emotion? And the reason why he has provided this idea of the elephant and the rider is he likes to make the argument that we are primarily emotional creatures, that that reason and logic is actually a bit more of a secondary emotion. And then when push comes to shove, just like if the elephant and the rider both got scared, who would win? And the answer is, who would win, Margi, if the elephant and the rider both got scared and they wanted to go in different directions? Which direction are they going in?
The elephant's direction.
Right? Yeah, because the elephant is just way stronger. And that's what Jonathan Haidt is trying to say in his book. He basically makes the argument that we arrive at our conclusions primarily on an emotional basis, at an emotional level. And then if logic or reason is to be involved at all, we oftentimes bring logic in later or reason in later to justify the decisions that we arrived at emotionally. And they're able to actually do brain scans to show that when we've got a decision to make, and there's a rational part of the brain and a logical part of the brain that's involved in making the decision, as I remember, they can actually see the emotional brain firing prior to the logical brain in sort of a sequence that shows that the logic comes after as a way to justify. And we all, I think, can relate to this idea of how this happens. And it's probably best portrayed in a Mormon context from the sort of orthodox apologetic point of view versus the liberal progressive post-Mormon point of view. Because if we know anything about confirmation bias, which is another concept in psychology, we can be presented with evidence, but we are either going to grasp and cling to the evidence if it supports our emotion-based worldview, or we're going to reject and throw away any evidence that doesn't support our emotional worldview. And that's just one of many instances of confirmation bias, where you can present this information. The CES letter, for example, which many progressive and post-Mormons stumble upon, they can read the CES letter, and because they're primed in certain ways emotionally, they're loving every minute of it and absorbing it and reading it as if it's a soulmate, But you can share that same CES letter with someone who's an Orthodox believer, and they can read that and go, oh my gosh, the CES letter just strengthens my Orthodox testimony. It just confirms to me that the church is true. And that's because I'm making the argument that Jonathan Haidt also makes, that primarily, if we had to pick at our center, at our core, we're emotional beings. Now, Margi, I'm going to come to you in a second, Natasha. Do you want to disagree with that? Agree with it? Add any color? Anything you want to say about that?
Can I just add a thought I had? I don't know if it's right, but one thought I was thinking about was, do you think that's most true in situations where you have, emotions come up for you, like fear? Or so, like, if you're talking about your children, if you're talking about, so where survival actually is at the core on some level, that's perceived survival. It could be psychological survival. But if you're dealing with things that have very little, relevance, or they're more abstract, or do you think that could change a little bit, that interplay?
Are you saying the stronger the emotion is kind of
tied
throbbing,
to the subject that you're talking about, or that you're,
that if you're talking about some subject like, whether or not this rock is nice,
Yeah.
If neither of us are emotionally charged,
Yeah.
maybe that maximizes our ability to be analytical.
To maybe be, more on the rider side than the elephant side. But in those topics or areas of our lives where we actually have a survival component, a large fear component, then we get triggered into that amygdala.
Fear or joy or
situation.
love
Sure.
or compassion or sensitivity.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense. Natasha, what would you add?
So I think just the point of this is for all of us to take a, humble pie piece, because we like to think that we're in control. We like to think that we're super, smart and think through a lot of our things logically. I think that's a very natural way to think about ourselves. And yet, just through the study of social science and psychology, we find more and more that we are hugely impacted by what I would call subconscious or even unconscious forces that then lead to kind of involuntary reactions. The fight, flight, freeze response is one that most people have heard about, and that's very much an involuntary process. You can in nanoseconds get to a point where your heart rate is up, your eyes are dilated, your IQ is lowered, believe it or not, when you're in that state. So you become actually stupider when you're feeling threatened, which can help you with running away from a lion, but it doesn't help you in debating the CES letter, right? And so when your IQ is lowered. And so I think it's just a reminder for us to understand that we are affected by our biology, our genetics, past trauma, our environmental forces, mental health considerations, how our brains are wired, extrovertism, introvertism, so many things that really are just such a huge component of who we are to begin with, that we have very little to no control over. And yet we're trying to navigate a life where we feel like we're totally in control and we can make all these choices and decisions on our own. And why it's so easy to fall into that kind of narrative of like, well, I have figured this out. And if I've figured this out with as logical and smart as I am, why can't everybody else figure it out the same way? Like, that doesn't make any sense, you know? And yet you take any passage, religious scripture, political statement, quote, and people will have very different reactions and responses given a myriad. I mean, we could list probably 30 different factors and traits that go into who we are as human beings. So I think this model that John's talking about really nicely kind of simplifies some of these ideas in a way that is very you can consume it easily.
Mm-hmm.
Love it. Okay. So why are we talking about that? Let's now kind of go back to our discussion a bit about the faith crisis. What we want people to do is to think about their own conversion for a second. And again, sometimes Mormons haven't really thought about this. And what I think it'd be fun to do is to go around the room and have each of us share our own personal conversion. And, you know, if we had one, or if we had multiple, or if we had sort of levels or moments of conversion, what was it? And so, Natasha, why don't you go first? Did you at some point feel like you were an Orthodox, devout Mormon? And if so, can you pinpoint a moment or moments that contributed, and whatever factors that contributed to that conversion for you?
Sure. Yes, I absolutely would have considered myself a very believing, very Orthodox Mormon member, wanting to do all the things that I'm supposed to do and be righteous and follow the life, right? And so I would definitely put myself in that category. I was one that always felt a little bit like I wasn't quite having some of the experiences that other people were reporting, like in testimony meeting. And it's interesting that a very spiritual experience I had in the temple as a young woman when I went for baptisms and things of that nature for the dead, was actually a spiritual experience about how I didn't have to be spiritual in the same ways as everybody else was showing up. So I was reading I think it was the Ensign, or maybe it was the New Era for the kids, for the teenagers. And in the temple room, you know, where you're kind of allowed to meditate for a while, the chapel, I guess is what it was called. And it had this article in there about how we're all given different gifts. And for some people, it is their gift to know, to have that knowledge, you know, that when people got up and shared their testimonies and said, I know that this is true. And I always felt like, well, I want to think it's true. I think it is true, but I'd never had like some of those experiences that people talked about where, you know, the heavens were opened and they just knew, and everything in their body just responded to, like Moroni's promise, you know, reading the Book of Mormon, for example. I never had something like that. So then the next paragraph talked a little bit about, and for some, the gift is to kind of rely on the testimony of these other people who know. And I was like, wow, you know, I hadn't never thought about that as a gift. And in that moment for me, I had a very spiritual experience. I felt very validated. I felt very kind of listened to by heavenly parents. I felt seen. I felt like my experience in Mormonism mattered too. And it didn't have to look like that classic traditional testimony for my testimony to still be of worth and of value to me. So that was kind of a moment I remember amongst others that were spiritually important to me.
And so you, in your narrative sort of your testimony, you would have sort of added that experience in as like some pinnacle that was like, boom, that was this experience that solidified my testimony. Is that sort of right?
Yeah, sort of, except for I never felt like it was solidified. So I felt it was like as a testimony that it was okay for my testimony to not be solidified. Mm-hmm. And it was kind of this like, it's okay to go about your Mormonism in a slightly not rigid way like that, you know, where I felt like I had to have that type of experience, or I was a subpar Mormon per se.
But it was accompanied with some type of flow or energy, or, you know, warm fuzzies.
Yes,
like
all the feelings.
You could describe how did that manifest for you?
Oh, it felt comforting. It felt, like I said, I felt heard. I felt validated. I felt like I mattered. I felt like I wasn't necessarily subpar anymore. So it made me feel more
And
confident
was there
in
like
my
tingling?
Mormonism.
Did you like tingle in your back going down
Yeah,
your?
for me, those feelings have always, followed kind of this, like, the hairs kind of on my arms, and a warm sensation all in my chest area that kind of creeps its way up and flushes my face. And oftentimes emotion, like I might tear up in those moments. Just a feeling, it's a very overwhelming kind of feeling that I can feel. And I felt those things, that for me was spirituality, but I've felt those things outside of like religious, I've felt that with songs or poetry or different types. I mean, it wasn't always in a religious setting that I'd have those feelings, but I definitely correlated all of that to my quote unquote truth or testimony.
Exactly. And did you come up with that idea? Like, you could have had those feelings and thought, oh, that was a really good burrito that I just ate, right? But that's not the association you made. When you had those feelings, you associated it with the church being true or good. And I would just ask, do you remember if at any point you were taught to make that association?
I was absolutely taught to make that association, although I don't think Mormonism is the only place that taught me or that we are taught to make associations with our feelings. And so I just want to make sure that we're very clear about that. But I was absolutely taught that in Mormonism. And I was seeking those experiences because Mormonism encouraged me to have experiences where my emotions would match my truth. Now, if I listened to a sonata that I felt that same way, I still would have seen that as truth. Like, this is beautiful. This is a good rapport. This is lovely. This is something of worth in my life. I don't think you need to be Mormon or not Mormon to have that correlation be there. But Mormonism, I think, puts it on steroids.
Yeah. I remember the seminary scripture mastery verse that I memorized and that I used on my mission. It came in Galatians, in the New Testament, Galatians 5:22 and 23. I don't have the King James Version, but I have the New International Version, and it says, but the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Against such things there is no law. And as missionaries, we would sit down with these people, talk to them about Jesus, talk to them about a loving Heavenly Father, talk to them about families being forever. And if I had to talk about the mechanistic process goal of the missionary discussions, and I don't think the church would hide this, it was to get them to feel those warm, fuzzy, tingly feelings that you just described, Natasha, and then to interpret it for them and to say, see that thing you're feeling right there? Do you feel it? That's the Holy Ghost. That's the member of the Godhead whose responsibility is to bear witness of the truth. And so we would literally interpret it for them and say, those feelings, the warm, fuzzy feelings you're having about your family, about eternal families, heaven, God, whatever, a loving Savior that atones for your sins, that means the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is the one true church upon the earth, which means that Gordon B. Hinckley is a prophet of God, which means that the Book of Mormon is true, and we had this big old heaping list. It means that you should get baptized. It means you should get confirmed. It means you should get married. And all of a sudden, we add a lot to those tingly feelings, don't we?
Yes, and I would agree with that. I just want to point out that we're not the only entity that does that.
No,
We
you
do
made that
that.
point, and I'm not trying to say that we are,
Right.
but I'm saying that's how
and I totally agree with you. It does. It's a very either or approach. If this is true, it's a very equational approach. If this one thing is felt over here, then it has to mean all these other things are tied to it. And that's where I think it becomes very complicated for people when this one thing is very helpful and spiritual and wonderful, and then yet some of these other things along the way are not, right? And so then you start that cognitive dissonance that you mentioned prior.
Yeah, and I'm not. And then again, we like to remind her, Natasha, that this podcast is for believers and non-believers. This is not a condemnation or even a negation or a negative deconstruction of people's sacred conversion experiences. But it's important that we understand just how things are happening, how the missionary process works, how the conversion process works. And it's undeniable that this is kind of what's going on. Now, that doesn't mean people's experiences aren't divine. If you interpret it that way, that doesn't mean they're not real. That doesn't mean they're not important. But what's important is to understand that this is the context that so many of us, constitute or come to understand our faith. And by the way, that doesn't mean that once you lose your faith, these experiences that are often sacred have to be thrown out as meaningless. And we can talk about that maybe in another episode. But I just want to make sure everyone knows that just because we're talking about this doesn't mean we're poo-pooing or trashing these sacred experiences. We're just trying to understand them.
When I talk about this in workshops, I really talk about kind of taking off my Mormon hat. And it's just what we're really talking about is social science. And that this is how in Mormon culture, we correlate different experiences. And that's kind of the narrative and the script that we're offered. So if I was going to go to any social scientist out there who knew enough about Mormonism to kind of give an opinion, these are the things that they would say, just like you can talk about American culture or, Italian culture or Mormon culture, or Jewish culture. Like there's narratives and scripts that each culture has. And I think you've pointed out very well that in the conversion process, especially through missionaries, this is the narrative. This is what we do. And it is what it is. It's not bad or good. It's just what the narrative and script is. And we're all affected by that in different ways. So I'm just adding more kind of ways to frame what the same thing I think we're all saying.
Yeah. Another really important term in this discussion for those who aren't familiar is epistemology. Epistemology is the study of how we know things. And talking about these sorts of things is an attempt to explore how we know or how we think we know things. Because oftentimes, and this is just true in any aspect of life, we think we know something when we really don't. We say, memory's faulty. People experience things in different ways. We grow and mature in our understanding. We explain things sometimes with limited understanding. But in a billion cases throughout our lives, we'll say we know something when we don't know it. And sometimes the opposite of what we think we know is true.
There's a TED Talk about that.
Which one?
I'll have to look it up, but it's something about what it feels like when we know, and the whole point of it is like it feels like the same thing as when we actually don't know. Right.
And one of our listeners, Christine Nielsen Oki, reminds us of a really good book that's a resource. It's called Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. But that's one of many books that you can reference on this topic. So, and of course, in addition to that Ephesians or that Galatians scripture that I read, there's also the scripture in the Doctrine and Covenants about Joseph Smith, and he's encouraging us to study it out in our mind. And if we know it's, and then ask the Lord if it's not true. And if it's true, the Lord will cause a burning in the bosom to come into our hearts, which is this enrichment or in this enlargement of the soul. It's this sense of flow, of euphoria. And then, of course, Moroni 10:4 also talks about getting a witness as well through the same sort of setup. And so this is sort of how Mormonism teaches us to gain a testimony. And it's something we should all be aware of. Now, I'm going to come back to you in a sec, Natasha. Margi, did you have a TED Talk you wanted to share with people?
Sorry. So the TED Talk that I was referencing earlier is Catherine Schultz, and it's titled On Being Wrong.
Yeah. And so we should paste all these into the
Great.
Into the feed so that people can reference these.
Okay.
Because these will all be useful. Now, Natasha, let's go back to your story, and then we'll go to Margi's. you mentioned this, you sort of mentioned your testimony as, and I'm setting up a straw man because I know it's more complicated than this, but when you talked about you talked about this moment where you were struggling and thinking about something, and so you were reading something, and then all of a sudden you were kind of praying or in thought, and then you got some sort of really important feeling. And that's all part of your experience, and that's all part of all of our experiences. What it doesn't account for are all the other major factors that likely contributed to your testimony. So I'm going to just go through a couple on our list, and I'm going to ask you whether these things were also factors. The first factor that we talk about is familial. Most people who convert to a religion or who are orthodox in a religion happen to be raised or born into that religion or raised in that religion. In other words, if Natasha with the same DNA, the same year, the same you, if you happen to be born in India to Indian Hindu parents, right? Chances are you wouldn't have, at whatever age, what age were you when you had that awakening?
Oh, like 15 or so.
Chances are at age 15, you wouldn't have been sitting somewhere in, Mumbai studying a Book of Mormon or Doctrine and Covenants or whatever it was, and having this emotional awakening that the Mormon church was true. Chances are you would have been having that. You would have been having some other experience, probably related to Hindu or Islam, that would have been testifying of whatever religious understanding your family had bestowed upon you. Is that fair, Natasha, or would you reject that?
I think that's absolutely fair. I think I would have had emotional, spiritual experiences, kind of asking similar questions, maybe even, or at least questions of the same, under the same umbrella. And I would have been having them through the narrative and script offered to me by that culture. My parents converted to Mormonism when I was about 5. I remember the missionaries coming to our home. I remember the positive experiences we had with those young men. I remember the meaning and the, kind of intellectual and emotional aspects of my father's and my mother's conversion. And those were narratives that started becoming very important in our immediate family at that time. And it was off to the races. So absolutely, this is what I mean by it's so important to make that tribal connection, that we are members of tribes and we only survive in tribes. We are not able to survive in isolation. That has been proven over and over again. Even with food and water, we cannot thrive and survive in isolation. And so part of learning how to survive is acclimating to the narrative and the culture and the scripts of those around you. And we all do this. And this is why I take a little bit of, when people start talking about indoctrination and brainwashing and these kind of terms that tend to be somewhat problematic or provocative for believers, I think you don't escape really those types of dynamics, regardless of the homes and cultures that you're a part of. Now, they can be more rigid or flexible. So systems do differ in how differentiated they are, but they all provide some level of, in essence, indoctrination to the beliefs, the scripts, the narratives that culture and family system subscribe to.
Totally. And you've introduced the second pillar that we're going to get to in a second. You introduced the social pillar, the tribal one, and we're going to get to that for sure. But I just want to make sure you just said it, that your parents had converted to the church. Did you, I imagine as a kid, did you feel like it would have meant a lot to your parents for you to have a testimony?
Oh yeah, for sure. I don't know that we ended up being kind of a part active, inactive family, where I think in some convert families that can be a little bit different of a dynamic than in families where you've been invested for generations, like some of those who've been from pioneer stock. We didn't have that much investment in the story of Mormonism. But I think especially when I was younger, it was very much a part of our family identity. And we didn't really have some of those struggles until some of my siblings were in college or so. And so in that moment, we were a military family. We were moving around. Mormonism was a family of its own, that it offered us a lot of structure, a lot of comfort, a lot of stability, and along with these spiritual experiences that were all part of this new narrative in our lives that was very meaningful and helpful in many ways.
And so as that teen kid, do you think, what would the parental influence have been on you feeling like you wanted to arrive at that testimony? You would just, without talking about any other factor, how might your parents have influenced your desire to and your ultimate arrival at that conclusion?
Well, I think that they influenced me from the beginning, and they were very proud of me. What I do want to say, though, and this is kind of interesting, because for me, it became quickly, it wasn't my parents who were the people I was looking for approval from. It was really the church leadership.
Okay, we'll get to there next.
Okay.
So you can just focus on your parents. Did they have any influence?
They did have some, but I don't think
What
that if
was
I
that
would have
influence? What was that influence?
Well, the influence was that, especially as they were going through some inactive times, I became kind of the stalwart, like the one who would run the family home evenings as the teenager, the one who would bring scriptures to the family.
But even before that, had they primed you in the church?
Well, they did through their conversion.
Yeah.
Yes.
And bringing you to church. Did you go to church on your own?
Sometimes I did.
But in those early years?
Right. So when I started driving, I oftentimes brought myself to church. But earlier than that, they were more active, and they brought me to church.
Okay,
and whether I was doing it on my own or whether I was doing it with them, they were super proud, super supportive, super happy that I was following that path, even if they weren't following it in the same maybe orthodox way that we started out.
Yeah. And that's all I'm trying to say is many of us are primed by our parents to arrive at a conclusion that the church is true and that we're committed to it. And that can happen through family home evening lessons, scripture study lessons, taking us to church, bearing their testimonies to us, whatever that is. I think more often than not, family arrives as the primary pillar of someone ultimately converting to a religion. Now, there are exceptions, but I'm just making the argument that that's probably, for most of us, the primary pillar.
Yeah, the only exception I would say to that is I know a lot of teenagers who convert, or a lot of kids in their early teens, and a lot of times those kids are coming, not all the time, from abusive situations, or but some of them are, like their family isn't the pillar that they need it to be, and so the church kind of steps in.
But that's an important point.
There's a million exceptions.
Yeah,
that's not the point I'm making. The point I'm making is the primary pillar for most of us is the parental influence. And I don't think we always stop to think about that. Like, why was I Orthodox Mormon? Well, for many of us, it's what we were born into. And if we were born in Pakistan, we'd probably have become Orthodox Muslims. And if we were born in Mexico City, the chances are we would have been Orthodox Catholic. And that's it's obvious, it's kind of face value, but I just think it's worth mentioning.
Well, on some level, for both of you, I see the parental influence in both of what you're saying. It's in what you're saying too, Natasha, that certain wounds or a lack of in a family culture can also drive a child to seek meaning kind of elsewhere. So parental influence, it works,
both ways.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So Margi, let's introduce your story in here. So tell us a bit about your faith journey, and if there's a time or two where you can pinpoint a conversion.
Okay, well, I think probably the best place to start is the beginning, because that really was the emotional route to my conversion, which is that so I come from a convert family, and my parents converted when I was around 7 or 8 years of age. And so my mom took the discussions for like, I think 6 to 9 months. And then my dad kind of followed at around a year. And then my brother and I were both baptized after that. But the emotional component to that, the actual conversion part of that, was the sealing and the promise of this idea that family matters, that it can last forever. And so I have that vivid memory in the temple, warm feelings. We're all gathered. My sister Catherine is on the altar
As a baby.
And then you have sort of the three other children that were born, as a result of joining the church. So for me, the nest is sort of this emotional tie and promise of the family ideal.
Right.
So
Now,
that would be the first kind of component.
And then talk about the stuff that I referenced later.
And then later, I would probably say I had this reframing.
Around when?
This is probably teen years of like, okay, I don't have this internal conversion. I'm not really feeling for like the doctrine, if you will. But then I thought, oh, I have this lived testimony, right? Where when I live the behavioral things, I feel good inside. It makes my life better. And so that's how what I adopted all the way through college, was just this idea of, yeah, I don't have that testimony like I really believe or I really know it's true. And I didn't say those words amidst my teen, but I have this lived experience testimony. And that lasted all the way through college, when I tried to meet that again and took the discussions while I was attending BYU over the summer with my dad in North Carolina.
Why with your dad?
Because I really respected my dad, and I felt like our minds were similar. He was a poetry literature undergrad. And high integrity, really thoughtful, loving, a psychiatrist, just a beautiful. So I thought maybe I could see like a testimony through his eyes and see what it looks like to him. And that will help me.
Yeah. So did it mean a lot to have your dad there?
So it was a beautiful experience my dad was a quiet person when it came to sort of sharing or putting his points of view on people. And so it was a great way to kind of see him. And he had a very literary, to me, at that time, I experienced his testimony as, something that was like literature and truth that way.
And do you feel like your parents ultimately would have or were pleased with you gaining a stronger level of testimony or conversion?
Absolutely.
And how would you have known that?
I think because we were firmly invested in family home evenings, we were firmly invested in cultural things in the church. My mom was Young Women's president, so I was, very behaviorally I had to go to dances, I had to go to all those things. So that level of sort of conformity and really desiring. And I also had a brother who at times was kind of in and out, and it caused a lot of pain and disruption. So I think watching that, I could see, and I really cared about my parents. And so, I felt very, a sense of responsibility to be good.
Love it. Okay. And I'll throw my experience in really quick, and then we'll go through some of the other pillars. I'm a sixth generation Mormon. My mother is related to Ezra Taft Benson and Samuel Rose Parkinson. She grew up devout and faithful. My grandmother was the daughter of a polygamous wife. And so my grandmother, whom I knew, remembered her sharing her mother with the other wives of her father. And so all that sort of devout, Orthodox, pioneer, religious Mormon stock certainly framed my upbringing in the church. When Ezra Benson came to Houston for some sort of area conference, we picked him up at the airport, drove around with him, returned him to the airport. It was this idea of royal Mormon pioneer lineage in our blood. And that definitely was a solidifying force, familial solidifying force for me from the very beginning. And then, of course, we did the reading the illustrated pages of the Book of Mormon and the New Testament and the Old Testament growing up as kids the best we could. We had family evening the best we could, even though we fought. I would hear my parents bear their testimonies regularly. And even though my parents got divorced, I still felt like both my parents had strong testimonies. And just the idea of being Mormon and all those years prior of being raised in the church was all because of my family. And so for me, very much my family also was a very integral part of my commitment to the church. And I could remember my dad and mom, whenever they bear their testimony in church, how passionate or touching it was for them to share. And it made me want to have a testimony of my own. And I did feel like my parents wanted me to serve a mission and get married in the temple. And I would see these babies get blessed in church by their fathers, where the fathers would say, I bless you that you will get a testimony. I bless you that you will serve a mission. I bless you that you will get married in the temple and have your own kids. And the patriarchal blessings as well. It was all wrapped into this idea of family, and family was center. And so I think we're probably belaboring the point, but I do think that this is important because what makes a faith crisis so hard? For me, if I had to say what's the number one hardest thing that people deal with in a faith crisis, it's family, isn't it? Like, what's the number one thing? It's disappointing your parents, disappointing your spouse, disappointing your children, aunts and uncles, grandparents. And so that's not a bad indicator of what your testimony was predicated upon, is if you start doubting and leaving it, where is the pain? And Natasha, would you disagree? And again, you're really good at coming up with the exceptions. And I love that, because there are a lot of people, even our listeners, who are resonating.
Do have exceptions.
So Victoria writes, I was raised in an atheist family. I was the only one to join the church and the only one to leave. Cynthia also writes, I converted at age 17. I was the only member in my family and didn't have any parental influence. So yes, Natasha, your exceptions are always valuable. And is it true as a marriage and family therapist to people in faith crisis that if you had to pick the single most difficult or painful variable to having a faith crisis, it would be family?
Yeah, so maybe a slight way I would just say it a little bit differently, although I primarily agree with you. I think the most acute part of a faith transition is individual. I think the most chronic part of a faith transition is familial.
Ooh.
So tell us what you mean, but focus on the family part for now, because we're going to talk about the other stuff later.
Well, just briefly, what I mean is I think initially it's existential for you individually, and that's a very acute, like all of a sudden you're wondering, your own identity and stuff. But then the whole process becomes relational.
Mm-hmm.
The whole process can't not be relational, and that's what I think you mean by it's the primary kind of ongoing chronic concern. Am I letting people down? My own kids, my spouse, my parents, my siblings, my friends, my ward community, it just, the whole thing cannot not be relational.
Yeah. And whether it's fearful of losing your marriage, fearful of being disowned, fearful of disappointing your kids, these family issues are so interwoven. And again, when you think about communicating with, now let's say you're the non-believing standpoint, you're progressive or post-Mormon, and you're figuring out, you've got this desire to get people on your same page and you want to deconstruct their faith. You want to ruin their faith so that they can be empathetic with you and go where you go and feel what you feel and see what you see. what the point I'm trying to make there is, what you have to understand is you're messing with people's family. You're messing, in Margi's case, with those memories of her sitting around the altar with her baby sister on the altar and her family feeling this warmth and connection. You're messing with my ancestors. You're messing with my pioneer ancestors that crossed the plains. You're messing with my marriage. And we were sealed. And, you know, that sealing is like what I'm living for as an Orthodox Mormon. I'm going to be together with my beloved and our children in the eternities. So you have to understand that instead of dwelling in your anger and your reactivity to want to win a convert to your disaffection, you have to realize that what's standing between you and the person, and what's standing all around that person that you're trying to influence, is all these deep and intense and emotional family ties that are as profound as almost any influence upon us. And so we should all have pause and care, and take deep care as we start venturing into those waters, realizing that these are very powerful and sacred associations that so many of us, but not all of us, have.
Well said.
Is that okay?
And they're legitimate. They're spiritual. And I think back to one of the original comments of Casey is, how do you start making sense of these things when you're in the new framework? But that falls right back into that either or equational thing. I think it's okay to have legitimate, spiritual, meaningful, you make meaning in that context, and you can make meaning in a new context. It does not have to be either or.
Yeah.
Totally. And that's what this whole podcast is about. It's about creating new meaning and context from a new paradigm.